midlife looks different now. You think? We've got more data, more tools, and more opinions than ever. Yet, clarity still feels like something that we're lacking. So here we are. I'm Rosemary, and this is Second Opinion, where science meets story and better questions hopefully lead to better decisions. Each episode, I sit down with clinicians, thought leaders, and real people who are redefining what it means to feel strong, clear, and well. Again, especially in midlife, because a different perspective can change everything. But before we go there, a quick ask, okay? So if this conversation supports you, just tap that subscribe button. It really does help people find the show and, get some of the answers that they've been needing, but they didn't even realize. And here's the thing. You can always opt out later, but after this, I don't think you're going to want to. All right, so today's guest is Josh Wageman. Now, I usually give a very formal introduction as the journalist that I am. However, I am going to be a little bit informal today, and I hope that you guys enjoy this. So we've got, just set the scene. We've got a PhD, a youth pastor, and an ex-Ivy League collegiate athlete walk into a bar. And then what happens? So, Josh, I'm going to let you take it from here.
Yeah, and what's funny about that is that's very similar to what I have like on the back of my book. It sounds like the start of a really bad joke or perhaps a super awesome dream. And so I kind of have been called some sort of centaur of sorts, given my very diverse, convoluted, and somewhat confusing background. And basically, all of these letters behind my name, which represents kind of a obnoxiously viscous alphabet soup, basically says, hey, I've had the pleasure of having many opportunities, learning a bunch of stuff, and ultimately I have very few useful skills except going to school, taking tests, and then hopefully talking about them. And sometimes I write books about the things I've had the privilege of learning along the way. So you are far too kind. I'm very much looking forward to having this conversation and bringing some clarity and hilarity to cholesterol and cardiovascular disease, which has historically been quite a contentious and confusing topic.
So I will tell you this, as the journalist that I am, I always prepare, but in true journalistic style, I downloaded your book on Audible and I started listening to it this weekend. And then of course the OR called, I had to go for an aortic dissection, ECMO was calling. So I've been listening to it in bits and pieces. So I didn't get all the way through yet, full disclosure, but I have to say what I started listening to. Okay, so I had this interview set up and yes, we're going to do the whole cholesterol conversation. But what I loved when you set up the book, and I didn't even think about it this way because we compartmentalize things, right? We have like glucose, cholesterol, all the things, right? That you had said makes all of this conversation so confusing. So before we dive into cholesterol per se, what I love at the very beginning of your book, which we'll talk more about the book because I think I even think clinicians are going to want to listen to it because it's going to actually help you talk to patients better as well, because the way you simplify everything. So in midlife, I know heart attack, stroke, dementia, right? We don't think of these things when we're younger, right? We're resilient. But as we get older and this starts happening to people around us, fortunately, I've been really healthy, but I know very healthy people that these sorts of things are happening to, and it doesn't add up. So you say something interesting in the book, and I think it's important to talk about this, and it might even be another episode, but you said basically controlling your insulin is basically to control your life, and a lot of connecting the dots to cholesterol. I think that will help a lot of people get into the cholesterol conversation and maybe look at why everything matters and not just concentrate on like one thing. So how do you feel about that? Talking a little bit about that.
So what's funny about that is, first off, I did narrate my audiobook. I figured it was either Morgan Freeman or myself, and he was, quote, busy. And so I decided to read my own book. And I always say, if you hate me as a person or you can't stand listening to me talk, then don't buy my book, which is written very conversationally, or listen to the audiobook. However, I feel like, most people tend to laugh a little, learn a little, and then come away with a relatable framework for not having heart attacks, strokes, and dementia, which is the whole key. But with life and with medicine and with everything, people want things to be binary. They want this to be good or bad. And really, it's complicated. There are very few things in biology that you can take to the bank. But nobody's New Year's resolution, it's almost 2026. Nobody's New Year's resolution is, boy, I think I'm going to be more insulin resistant in 2026. No, nobody said that. And I actually just made shirts because one of my mantras that I've said forever is control your insulin, control your life. Because it's not just about having normal blood sugars. It's about having the normal amount of insulin secreted to keep those blood sugars normal. Because hyperinsulinemia, with or without hyperglycemia, drives a ton of chronic diseases in our westernized society. And so I think this is a nice segue into just my general framework for not having heart attacks, strokes, and dementia, which no one wants. It's just how we get there. We need to get there together, and we all need to have an understanding of this, and then we can all live happily ever after. And so, for everyone, whoever you are, because you do not want to have a heart attack, stroke, or down the line dementia, I want you to have a great home security system, and I want you to live in a safe lipid neighborhood. Your home security system has 4 basic pillars: normal blood sugar, and along with that, normal insulin, normal blood pressure, keep inflammation low, and don't smoke or do drugs, because those are bad. Those are the things we want. Those are the axioms. No matter what your lipid neighborhood is looking like, nobody wants to be more insulin resistant. Drugs are still bad. And despite what my patients have told me, 220 over 120 is not normal for you. And, I just saw a squirrel, coming in here. No, that's bad. You're about to have a stroke. So, these are things that we can take to the bank. And no one ever says, oh, I wish I was more systemically inflamed. Also, no. And so those are the 4 pillars of the home security system. But then your lipid neighborhood, well, that's your cholesterol panel, because every ApoB containing lipoprotein, the vast majority of those being LDL particles, is potentially a criminal that can infiltrate your arterial abode. And the Lp(a) particles, if you pick the wrong parents with that genetically determined lipoprotein, well, those are the felons, because per particle, they're more likely to cause mischief in your arterial wall if they get there than your run-of-the-mill LDL particle. So, how's your home security system? We're always checking our parameters of glucose metabolism. We can check your blood pressure. We can check markers of systemic inflammation. And if you're doing drugs, you probably ought to stop. So, we're looking at those. But then your cholesterol panel, that requires some context. People don't live on paper. It might look like you are living in a rough inner city neighborhood on paper, but do we have better ways, especially in midlife, of informing our decision-making process? We do. So one of my catchphrases is, got plaque? Get a CAC. What's a CAC? It's the coronary artery calcium score. I call it the colonoscopy of the heart without the nasty pregame show. Because you lay down, and a low-dose CT scan, which is the same amount of radiation as a mammogram, so virtually nothing, shows you if you've been broken into or not. Do you have calcified plaque in your coronaries, or do you not? Because if you do, that means there has been a break-in. There has been a break-in by a cholesterol-laden perpetrator. And do you want to keep living in the same rough lipid neighborhood where you've gotten broken into? Or perhaps do you want to consider moving to a nice, safe, gated community with fewer lipid criminals? That seems reasonable, right? And so that just sets the stage for this discussion of risk stratification, because we can't address what we haven't identified, and we can't just rely on one metric or even 2 metrics. We have to use all of the tools in our toolbox to first identify disease and then intervene accordingly if there have been break-ins to your arterial abode.
Yeah, no, I agree. And even as much as I know as a clinician, right? I'm in the OR. I'm surrounded by physicians every single day. We have these conversations. But even your book, the way you talked about it, it just made sense. So I don't say this lightly. I don't like to push anything on people, but I really, truly, after listening to what I've listened to so far, I thought even somebody with my background who's studied all these things for many years, it really does help connect the dots. And I even forgot, like, oh yeah, that does this, or that would be a great way to talk to patients about this or that. It just adds up. And then it had me thinking, because for me, my goal coming up is that my whole thing is now like longevity, my biological age, trying to be like 10 years, living, once I have my body age, right? Your biological age, but like, how old am I really, right? Like, I'm 53, but of course I would love to be my most optimal self, like a lot of our listeners here, and live at my best self right now. But also for me, it's like really looking at the whole big picture. And I really would love for you to get into, without getting like overly complicated, but to just talk about, why insulin, or how insulin does connect to, say, cholesterol. Because I think those two things, because we hear them in, like you said, silos, how they work together, and how, it's not, yes, we're focusing on cholesterol, but how that insulin really does connect, how those numbers connect.
Sure. Yeah. So a couple core concepts here. Insulin is a storage hormone. And so most people are aware that, insulin makes your blood sugar go down. That's true, but insulin really is a storage hormone. When you eat, insulin should appropriately go up, and it should stuff triglycerides in your cellular suitcases, which would be the adipocyte or the myocyte, so the muscle cell or the fat cell, so you can store it and use it for later, or you can use it in your muscle right then. And then when you haven't eaten, insulin should be low. However, many standard Americans following the standard American diet, there's a reason the acronym is SAD, they're always in storage mode and they never get to burning mode. And so one of my favorite biomarkers is a fasting insulin test, because fasting insulin should be quite low. I don't eat all night long, and I tend to pull the levers that I feel like are necessary for optimizing insulin sensitivity across the lifespan. I get flagged as a type 1 diabetic when I get a fasting insulin because it's really low. It's not because I have type 1 diabetes. It's because, I should be in burning mode rather than storage mode after an overnight fast. However, there are many people who have normal blood sugars, normal hemoglobin A1Cs, and their fasting insulin is super high, 10, 20, 30. Whoa! You're always in storage mode. That's not good. You're setting yourself up for long-term problems. And from just a lipoprotein standpoint, as far as the relationship between insulin and lipids, there are many, but I want to simplify this just for people right now. So basically, the purpose of lipoproteins, like the VLDL, IDL, LDL particles, are not inherently bad. They're mailmen. Most mailmen aren't necessarily bad dudes. And the job of these mailmen is to deliver triglyceride packages to your fat cell or your muscle cell, and then go home to the liver at the end of the day. However, what if your mailboxes are full? That would be if you chronically are in storage mode. Well, the mailmen are trying to deliver the mail. These lipoproteins are trying to deliver the triglyceride mail to the mailboxes, and mailboxes are full. So they keep driving around. Instead of actually doing their job, going home at the end of the day to the liver, they keep driving around. Well, if they keep driving around, what are they maybe going to do? I don't know. Run their trucks in your arterial wall. Maybe. And that's not a good thing. Additionally, people with diabetes, we know that people with diabetes have the most increased risk of atherosclerosis. Well, why is that? Well, have you ever driven in a storm? It's not real easy. I myself lived the song Jesus Take the Wheel when I got caught in a blizzard one time, and my car rolled off, flipped a couple times, and then God decided that it wasn't my time to go. Okay, I'm very thankful for that, but it was terrifying, and it's still indelibly etched in my memory of how terrifying that was. Well, here's the thing. If you're caught in a sugar storm, are you going to be a very good mailman? Probably not. And so that's why people with high insulin levels, and then people with high insulin levels and diabetes, because most people with diabetes, they still make insulin, they just do a very poor job of utilizing it. They're at increased risk of cardiovascular events because one of the mailmen goes rogue, runs his truck in your arterial wall, and it's the maladaptive immune response to that cholesterol-laden perpetrator that shouldn't be there that results in plaque formation and that can result in clinical events down the line. And so honestly, most things work out if you control your insulin, control your life. And that is why it is my mantra, and that's why I make shirts about it. I even have this bro tank that I go lift in, and people give me some weird looks at the gym, and I'm like, I'd be happy to talk about substrate utilization with you, but I don't know, people are weird. They don't want to do that sometimes. So it's a fun deal.
So you're saying when you look at your lab results, or if you're watching and you're trying to get a hold on these things. Usually say if you're looking at lab, just to simplify it for people listening, they go neck and neck. So if you're looking at, say, your glucose levels, your fasting levels, and then say your metabolic panel, my doctor, I love her. She's like, basically I can look at your labs and know your biography. Like, here's your life story. I can pretty much tell, not all the time, but she has a good idea of, what's going on with me just by looking at certain markers. So, or you say, usually if you've got one, then it's going to affect the other. So you don't have, right? Just when people are looking at their labs, because I know people get fixated on one or two things on their lab results, just because I have family and friends that come to me and they're so hung up on one thing. I'm like, it's not that easy. Like, it's not that, just so when people are looking at their labs, like how those two numbers affect each other and maybe things that they can do to alleviate some of that.
Yeah. So the lipid panel and then just like your metabolic panel that has your glucose and your liver enzymes and all those other things on there, they are distinct. And that's why both of these things matter. And that's why it's not really a yin and yang so much. It's like, okay, we need to look at our home security system. And then we also need to look at our lipid neighborhood, because you can just pick the wrong parents and live in a terrible lipid neighborhood, even though your home security system is quite good. And that's particularly true with people who might have elevated LP little a, which is a separate test. I call it the felon of the lipid neighborhood. And my friend's a good example. I mean, no elevated blood pressure, no insulin resistance, even by my standards, which is hard to do. His HSCRP, which is a measure of systemic inflammation, was 0.4, so basically non-existent. And then he decided to never do drugs, which is awesome. But he had a terrible family history, and his LP little a was quite elevated, and he had a CAC. He got a CAC, got Plaque, get a CAC, great test. And this guy was 49 at the time. His CAC was 2,814. And so he had to have a 5-vessel CABG, coronary artery bypass graft, because he had this fell into the lipid neighborhood. His 10-year risk calculator, which those are garbage in general, by the way, was 2.3%. His doctor just said, attaboy, keep doing what you're doing. Well, if he kept doing what he was doing, he'd be dead, So it's important to just know a few things, because all these things are distinct. However, your goal is always going to make your genetic predispositions worse in the context of insulin resistance. And that's why I'm really big on identifying insulin resistance early, just like I'm big on identifying if you've been broken into by a cholesterol-laden perpetrator early. And so elevated fasting insulin, and prediabetes and diabetes, it's kind of like being almost pregnant. You are or you aren't. It's just how far you are along in that process. And so fasting insulin is not a part of a standard panel, but I believe it should be. And savvy clinicians are starting to test that, because fasting insulin will rise way before your fasting glucose starts to rise and before your A1C starts to rise. And we want to abrogate that very quickly rather than just wait around for things to get worse. My whole goal with the books I write and all the podcasts I go on and all the things I talk about is to shift the paradigm from reactionary to preventive. And part of doing that, and a big part of doing that, is helping people control their insulin, control their life from an early age, rather than just waiting around for decades and, oh, you're pre-diabetic now. Uh-oh. No. We need to do that right now.
No, I love that you're saying that, because even as somebody who has a health background, when I get my own labs done, I'll have to ask for things. And a lot of people don't know to ask for these things, because like you, it's like, well, if I knew this, I can know this, or I should know these things, but for reason, and this isn't downing doctors, because I know they're very governed by insurance. And then there's also the conversation, well, when you have the information, what are you going to do with it? But when you, I feel like the lipo A and the lipo B, these are numbers that we're seeing more of in the wellness space. I don't know if it's just because I'm in this space, so I'm aware of them, but I feel like people need to know these numbers, but I don't feel like they test for these things, right? They don't traditionally get these in, say, your basic panel.
Yes. And that's, there's all sorts of biomarkers, and I love me some biomarkers, and I'm a lipid specialist. I'm a lipid specialist by board certification. And so, when my patients would come to me, they would expect all the fancy bells and whistles, and you can measure markers of cholesterol absorption and cholesterol production, and you can get NMR spectroscopies of advanced lipid panels and all the various subfractionations of all the particles. I understand them. I explain them in my books for people who really want to get in the weeds on how to interpret those. But in general, do you need all the fancy stuff? Probably not. But some of the tests that I think are really low-hanging fruit that I really think should be part of a basic wellness is that fasting insulin, along with your complete metabolic panel, LP little a. You either have it or you don't, and it's good to know. And also that CAC, especially in midlife. If you're a 13-year-old kid, a CAC isn't going to be real useful. You really haven't lived long enough to get broken into unless you have a horrible hereditary disorder of some sort. But so that CAC, I would like to treat it like the colonoscopy of the heart. The mean age of incident coronary artery calcium in white males in a recent study was 36.1. Oh, wow, that's actually pretty early. And people who have a non-zero score, age 32 to 46 from the Cardiac Consortium, have a 5x risk of a premature event. Oh, dang, we need to identify if there's been a break-in and then intervene accordingly. So my historic perspective was, hey, age 40, get your first CAC, fire up a 0, check back in 3 to 5 years, kind of like a colonoscopy. If you have a couple polyps, they don't just say, oh, all right, well, let's wait around for you to get colon cancer and do something. No, they take them out and you check back at regular intervals. Same thing. If you have been broken into, well, do we have tools that can stabilize plaque? We do. Do we have tools that can regress plaque? Also, we do. And that's a good thing. Not knowing doesn't make it go away. So now it might be actually a little bit earlier that I say, hey, get your first CAC. That said, people who are younger, even if they have a coronary artery calcium score of 0, they might still be in trouble if their home security system's a disaster or there's a few other things going on. That said, CAC's a wonderful test. No test is perfect, but it's a heck of a lot better than the 10-year risk calculators, which are, they miss so many people. They overestimate here, they underestimate here. And so my big thing is understanding the individual utility of each diagnostic test, of each biomarker, and then helping clinicians be better in that regard. And this book is to equip clinicians and patients alike with the information that I think goes into not having heart attack, strokes, and dementia, and shifting that paradigm to preventive. And I've had 5 different medical practices buy my book in bulk for their clinicians and their patients, and that's what I want. I want there to be something for everybody in this book and the way I write it. And I want to come across as relatable and approachable. And I want you to be my friend still, because if I am just saying things that no one understands, then you're like, ooh, yikes. Never want to talk to him again. But my goal with all these things is to walk with kings, but not lose the common touch. I strive to have a truly regal understanding of the physiology, but I also want to retain that common touch so that we can better impact people's lives on an individual basis there.
Yeah, well, what I've listened to so far, because full disclosure, I love to read, but as a city person, I commute on my feet, right? I'm jumping off and on trains, so I like to listen to things. Sometimes I listen and read. I go back because I need to take things in different ways. But what I'm getting so far from the book, too, is what I like. It's not so much focusing on this number as being bad or good. It's more like why this even exists, like how our body and how our cells use all these things, because cholesterol isn't necessarily, these are not bad things in our body. We need these things in our body to do their job. So if you would talk about that a little bit, because I know people will call me and say, well, but I also liked about your book too. There's so many good things that I got out of it. Only in the beginning is that you're, since we segueing into cholesterol and you are a lipidologist, high and low, just the different, your HDL and your LDL and how they can be misleading in your total cholesterol as well. And what we need and what's bad. If we can go there.
So I'll unpack a few things here. And this is why I have to write books about this. There's a lot to it, and one of my frustrations is in most of medical programs, and I'm adjunct faculty at multiple medical programs, and they get the Josh experience when these particular schools, hey, well, thanks. But really and I went to a wonderful program, but all I got taught and all most programs teach is LDL bad, HDL good, everybody take a statin. All right, on to the next thing. And that's why we need Zofran. That's why we need anti-nausea meds, because there's a lot more to it than that. And so Okay, so really what we first have to establish is that a lack of cholesterol is incompatible with life. And so cholesterol is an important part of cell membranes. Cholesterol is a precursor of steroidogenic hormones. 20 to 25% of total body cholesterol is in the brain. Cholesterol is a constituent of bile acids for digestion. So cholesterol is necessary. A lack of cholesterol is incompatible with life. However, every nucleated cell in your body produces its own cholesterol. It's real important. So your own cells make it. And what you see on a blood panel is only about 10% of your total body cholesterol. Because the purpose of these particles, the LDL bad, well, no, the purpose of the VLDL, IDL, LDL particles, which are the ApoB particles, B for bad if it's in the wrong place, is their mailmen. They deliver triglycerides, some phospholipids, a few fat-soluble vitamins to target tissues, and then they go home to deliver at the end of the day. So mailmen aren't inherently bad, but if that mailman runs his truck in your arterial wall, it's a bad mailman, and you cannot have atherosclerosis without one of these mailmen going rogue, and then the maladaptive immune response that ensues results in plaque formation and subsequently can result in clinical events. So it's always context that matters. But then HDL good. So HDL has historically been called the good cholesterol. And HDL is kind of like the police force. So HDL can do some really good things. And so an HDL cop can go in, and if there's a cholesterol-laden perpetrator in the arterial wall, he can actually bring it out and take it back to the liver to its appropriate jail cell. He can do that. An HDL particle can also function in glucose-independent uptake of sugar into your muscle cell. Well, that's a charitable community activity. HDL can also bind up lipopolysaccharides. If you're having a bad day, you have sepsis or something, an infection, and HDL can bind that up and take it back to the liver, save your life, and that toxin can be excreted in the bile. So, and it can do a whole bunch of other things too. So HDL, cholesterol, yeah, they can do some good things, but just looking at your roster of your police force doesn't tell you if it's a good cop, if it's a bad cop, if there's some good, some bad. You don't know. And so basically your marker of HDL cholesterol on paper gives you no idea of its functionality. And so a lot of people will be like, oh, my ratio is good. My triglyceride HDL ratio is good, which is generally a proxy of insulin resistance, but there are exceptions genetically to that as well. And just because your HDL cholesterol is high doesn't mean you're invincible. There are actually people who have quite high genetic HDL cholesterol, but it's dysfunctional and they can have accelerated coronary disease. And so it shouldn't prevent you from looking at all your other biomarkers and having the got plaque, get a CAC strategy just because you have a certain HDL cholesterol level. However, what we need to realize, low HDL cholesterol in general is associated with cardiovascular disease. But why is that? This is why. So, and I think it's important to understand the why behind these things so we can view things in the broader context. So remember, these are HDL cops. And so if you are insulin resistant and your mailboxes are full, well, the HDL cop tries to take the triglycerides from the ApoB particles that aren't delivering them. And so what happens is the HDL cop gets fat and fluffy with triglycerides. It's like a cop that's getting too overweight to pass his fitness test. Well, what happens is your body tries to do some damage control. There's a couple lipases, endothelial and hepatic lipase, and they're basically like bariatric surgeons, but they're not well trained. And so they're like, oh, okay, well, let's take care of this cop. And so what they do though is they do this attempted triglyceride removal procedure on the HDL cop, but they do a pretty bad job. So what you're left with is this gaunt, emaciated HDL particle who's no good for anything. And your body's like, oops. Well, now he's not going to pass his fitness test because he's too gaunt and emaciated. So what happens is then your HDL particle is catabolized actually by the kidney in order to get rid of it. And so if this happens over time and people have chronically high triglycerides over time because their mailboxes are full because they're insulin resistant, then you'll see low HDL cholesterol as part of the metabolic syndrome. But it's just telling you something more about the milieu than the actual function of the particle itself. But, that's why we see that. And, once again, control your insulin, control your life. Insulin resistance is associated with pretty much everything bad going on. And so that's really why we see that with HDL cholesterol. But just looking at it on paper, you don't know what it's doing or not doing. And so relying on an HDL cholesterol metric to tell you anything about what's going on with the criminals in your neighborhood, you don't know. And so, and that's an important thing to consider as well. And then statins, right? And we'll talk more about statins, but statins do a lot of good things. But they're not a panacea. And it's also important to identify who would benefit from a statin as well. And for any tool in our lipid lowering toolbox. And so, that's important to educate clinicians and non-clinicians alike of the available options. If there's been a break-in and you need to get living in a safer lipid neighborhood to, make sure that whatever plaque is in your arterial beds isn't going to come and get you someday.
So, yes, we're going to talk about statins for sure, because I know there's a lot of people that listen in who had a lot of questions for me about this. But I did listen to something in your book that I'm not sure if I heard it correctly. It was late last night, but I do want to address because I know I have a lot of healthy friends, right? You know, multiple avocados a day, all these things, right? They're, you know, they do all the right things. And I think in midlife now you're starting to apply everything, you know, you're a little bit more aware of these things and you're putting these things in your diet. So some friends have reached out to me and said, well, like you had said, you know, which you beautifully explained, HDL, LDL, and sometimes how that can be misleading. What you also talked about was alcohol and people who might, you know, follow all the rules, they work out, they eat really good, but they drink a little bit more than say, you know, they don't call it dry January for nothing, but anyway, but say like they like to drink. And people have asked me, and I never actually, who I do know their jobs entail a lot of social. So they're out, but they might be at the gym, they eat well. And I never even thought to bring that up. I think they're going to find this interesting, how alcohol affect your HDL. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and alcohol usage does increase HDL cholesterol, but it's not helping the HDL cholesterol do a better job. And so alcohol itself is a funny topic to me. I do all the youth ministries at my church, and I do not drink any alcohol primarily because I want to have the most profound influence on these kids, and the common sense and context cortices are underdeveloped in that population. And so if they knew, oh, you know, Josh does it, I'll do it. No, you're 15 years old, but you know, kids aren't able to to properly process those things a lot of times. So that's the primary reason why I don't drink alcohol. But then the secondary reason is because biochemically, there's no reason to. I mean, it's a toxin in many ways, and I go into that in chapter 2 of my book. I'll still be your friend. Don't get me wrong. And if you are an adult of legal drinking age, I mean, that's fine unless you're drinking to excess and becoming inebriated. But you know, there's a reason why alcohol isn't in anybody's cognitive nootropic booster. You know, it's not going to make you fire on all cylinders, and I prefer to, when I'm awake, be firing on all cylinders cognitively. So anyway, but alcohol itself does increase HDL cholesterol, but it does a whole lot of other things that I don't love, as far as inhibiting endothelial nitric oxide synthase, which is your vasodilator, so it can elevate your blood pressure. It results in some abnormalities in your mitochondrial metabolism, and it's basically a mitochondrial toxin. It's a neurotoxin, and there's really no compelling reason to use alcohol if you're wanting a performance benefit. It also disrupts your sleep quality. If you're a guy, it'll decrease your testosterone, maybe increase your estrogen, maybe give you some moobs if that's your goal. So, you know, it's just not a good idea in general if you're prioritizing performance. That said, I mean, okay, you know, it's not like illegal or something. And so, you know, I also think it's funny too, because I am in a lot of social settings and I don't ever drink alcohol myself, but it's the one thing you have to always explain why you're not doing it. And it's like, I think like mayonnaise, you don't ever have to explain. If you don't want mayo on something, you just say, oh, no mayo, please. You know, but it would be like, oh, mayonnaise. Yeah. Uncle Jerry, you know, he got into mayonnaise and boy, I saw how it ruined his life. So I'd never want to go down that road. I mean, you don't ever have to explain things, but with alcohol, you have to like have like a list of compelling reasons why you're not having a cocktail with your work colleagues. So I think it's hilarious.
No, I agree. I'm not a big drinker. It doesn't agree with me. I mean, I have a glass of champagne or something in a celebratory way, but I just don't like the way it makes me feel. I don't even know. I thought, do I have some kind of allergy? Because I really feel awful. It's just not worth it for me. But I'm with you, because the beautiful thing is that mocktails are like a thing. So you can like now nobody, but I'm like, why is everybody always so interested? Or then if I do decide to have a cocktail, which is rare, oh, you're drinking? I'm like, well, you have something to say if I don't drink. And then when I do drink, you have something to say. It's like, I can't win. Yeah. I'm like, it's such a thing. And I'm like, is it just a reflection of, am I making them feel bad? It's just, but you know, it's just such a topic. I feel like, yes, we could go on about, but I just thought it was worth mentioning because people might get their lab results and they think they do all the right things, but I don't understand why my HDL is so high. And it's like, maybe it's not the avocados. Maybe it's the cocktails you're having, the gin and tonics.
Yep.
Which is a cleaner drink, but still, you know.
Yeah. I would say there's no amount of alcohol that's useful for human performance. That said, when guys are high performers and guys who have elite cardiorespiratory fitness, whatever you're doing dietarily, if you have some alcohol here and there, honestly, it ends up not really mattering a whole lot because you're such a high performer. Now, I don't think you should fuel the machine with ethanol or other garbage, but at the same time, if you prioritize performance, as far as nobody ever said, I wish I was weaker, go pick up some heavy things. And nobody ever said, I wish I was a little less aerobically fit. No, also pull that lever. You're probably going to be okay. And the little things that people get very tribal over probably aren't going to matter quite so much.
No, so true. So true. So then talking about controversy a little bit, we will then now go into statins, because I feel like this topic, we're going to get there, is that it's a conversation, right? It's like, and depending on what narrative or what side of the aisle or, how you treat patients. But I do feel like, let's just talk about how they work and how they work with cholesterol. Because I think if we just go there, then it will help us then segue into the other things.
Yeah. So I think before we start specifically talking about statins, it would be helpful for listeners to know the three major players in clearance. I've talked about these guys, these particles being mailmen, and we want them to go home at the end of the day. But there are three major players in lipoprotein clearance at the liver. And so the three major players are the LDL receptor, ApoB, and then there's something called PCSK9, which stands for proprotein convertase subtilisin kexin type 9. And when you can rattle that off without sounding like you're going to throw up or stroke out, you've arrived at a special place of enlightenment in the lipid world. But I'm going to shift my metaphors here. And this is my daughter's favorite metaphor. And there's pictures of this in my book. And she can explain the lipid clearance system very, very well. And so basically the LDL receptor at the liver is like a claw grabber. You guys have been to the arcade and there's that claw grabber and you win the stuffed animal and pull it in. That's what the LDL receptor is like. It pulls in the particle and into the liver, and then it's degraded in the lysosome, and then it recirculates hundreds of times out to the cell surface. And so if you're at the arcade, you want that claw grabber to work, next kid, get in line. Okay. And then it wins the apo bear. So the ApoB on these particles is like a little apo bear, a little cute bear. It's like, oh, I'm going to win the apo bear with my claw grabber. So the claw grabber should win the apo bear and gives it to the kid. Next kid gets in line, and this is great. Everybody's happy. Everybody's winning the apo bears, and that claw grabber is in working order. Unless that PCSK9, it's like a hammer that puts the claw grabber out of order. And so PCSK9, if it's around in excess, it will bind to the claw grabber and put it out of commission. Instead of recirculating to the cell surface of the liver, it'll just put it out of commission and it'll all get degraded in the lysosome. Well, that's problematic, because if the claw grabber isn't doing its job, kids are getting in line, kids want to win the apo bear, but nobody's winning the apo bears. Kids are not very patient. What's the kid doing? Crying, getting in your arterial wall, causing heart disease. And so that's no good. So too much PCSK9, which means your claw grabbers are out of order, that's associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And not enough claw grabbers in working order, that's also associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease from a genetic standpoint. And then ApoB, if that apo bear is slippery and the claw grabber can't win the apo bear, well, then you're going to have way too many particles in your neighborhood, and that increases your risk of cardiovascular disease. And so those are the three big players in lipoprotein clearance. LDL receptors, that claw grabber, wins you the apo bear, and hopefully there's not too much PCSK9 around, because you want that claw grabber to stay in working order. And so that hopefully paints a good picture of what we want to happen. But when that homeostasis is dysregulated, we can run into problems. And so when we are discussing about our lipid lowering medications, there are three basic ways that we can address a corrupt workforce. Back to our mailmen. Okay. We can cut the workforce, because some of them are bad. Some of these mailmen are corrupt, so we're just going to cut the workforce. That's basically a statin. We can decrease the amount of spam mail that the mailman is going to deliver and you're just going to throw away anyway. That's ezetimibe. That's a cholesterol absorption inhibitor. Or we can just make sure that the mailmen have an awesome GPS system and ensure that the clearance is great and they go home at the end of the day. And that would be something called a PCSK9 inhibitor, because too much PCSK9, that's bad news. So those are the three essential basic ways. There are other ways that we can address this and other medications and stuff, but those are the three basic ways. Okay. So statins, they cut the workforce because they inhibit cholesterol synthesis. So that's just basic mechanism. They inhibit something called HMG-CoA reductase, which is the committed enzymatic step in cholesterol synthesis inside the liver. And when the liver doesn't have as much cholesterol inside the liver, which is tightly regulated, it will increase the amount of claw grabbers to pull more cholesterol in from the periphery. So that's basically how statins work. And ideally, you would want that to all happen at the liver, but sometimes it can affect other tissues that you maybe don't want as much, and that can lead to some side effects in certain people. Now, what's funny about statins is some people blame like natural disasters and like when the stock market tanks and all sources of existential angst on statins, it seems like. And then there are other people that think statins should be in the drinking water and we should all have what they call physiologic LDL cholesterol levels because you're born with an LDL cholesterol of 22 to 44. Newsflash, you're born with that, and then at 2 months, you're about 73 or, 65 to 80 or so because your fetal liver is immature. You're also often born with a blood sugar of like 30. So anyway, so I don't think that's a great argument for why we should all have physiologic levels. But anyway, so, there's all these tribes on both sides, right? And the answer is, well, let's understand who can benefit from these tools. Let's be honest about the good things it does, which are many, and let's be honest about what could happen side effect wise that we might not like as much. And so statins have more cardiovascular outcome data as far as reducing heart attacks and strokes than any other lipid lowering therapy. There are so many trials from the first one, which is 4S, and then there's WASCOPS, there's Jupiter, there's all these different studies, whether they're named after a planet or named after what part of Scandinavia the people are from, they have all this amazing data as far as reducing heart attacks and strokes. So they have all the data. And then statins mechanistically, they do help stabilize plaque. So if we've identified plaque, if there's a break-in, particularly you've got plaque, get a CAC, you have a positive coronary artery calcium score, well, those people tend to get benefit when we actually intervene to get them living in a safer lipid neighborhood. And what's interesting is statins can be kind of thought as regulators of autophagy. And so people hear the word autophagy a lot, and like Huberman or Peter Thiel say autophagy, and people are like, oh yeah, I want autophagy. And they don't really, know what it means, but they know autophagy good. And so, but basically what autophagy is cellular housekeeping. And so, basically statins kind of help your cellular housekeeping. If there's a mess in your house, you need to hire a cellular housekeeping force in order to mitigate that mess, or else things are going to get way, way, way out of hand. However, if you are really concerned about your cellular housekeeping and you've got big messes that need to be cleaned up around the clock, maybe you can't spend as much time at the gym. And that's how I like to anthropomorphize some of the side effects that result in statin-induced myalgias. You're worried about your cellular housekeeping, which is important. You need to clean up that mess in your arterial wall. But at the same time, could there be some effect on skeletal muscle? Yes. And the most famous side effect of statins is statin-associated myalgias or muscle pain. And it's a real effect. Okay. And so now the thing is, if you use a lower dose of statin in combination with other tools, you can mitigate all of the effects that people don't like about statins. So I'm a big fan of combination therapy outside of acute coronary syndromes where people have the big one. That's where the data shines for high intensity statin. But elsewhere, really what we're seeing is just increased side effects and not a whole lot more benefit. And so I'm a big fan of utilizing multiple tools in our toolbox if we've identified a break-in and we need to get you living in a safer lipid neighborhood. And so the myopathic symptoms, there are a few different mechanisms that can result in that. They've actually done muscle biopsy studies, and there is some inhibition of what's called the electron transport chain at complexes 3 and 4. Basically, the mitochondria are like your cellular battery, and they kind of prevent your battery from getting revved up to full capacity sometimes if you're especially on a higher dose of statin. That said, a lot of the people that were intervening, they're leaking battery acid on their cells anyway, just because of all sorts of issues that have resulted in this. So you're probably going to get a net benefit. But that's, one of the ways it can happen. There was a recent study that showed some effect on ryanodine receptors, which is important in muscle contraction. But, if you want to hit me up offline, we can talk about these mechanisms specifically, but probably people don't want to hear too much. But the effect is real. There are effects that show that with a nocebo effect of people who are on statin or on a sham, people when they cross over will still have symptoms. There are those symptoms, but also because mechanistically it's been shown that this is a real effect, I don't discount people when they come to me and they say, oh, I was on a statin and I had these side effects. If I say, okay, well, let's try a statin, they're going to leave the office and say, what a jerk, he wasn't listening to me. And so if the year were 2004, then I would bend over backwards to get you on any dose of statin because that's kind of all we had. And the strategy was take a statin and pray. I think we should always pray, but we also fortunately have other tools in our therapeutic toolbox now. And I'll meet people where they're at, especially if there's a reason to intervene with a statin or any lipid lowering therapy. But I think that what's really smart is to use combination therapy. So we identify if there's been a break-in. You've got a positive calcium score. Okay, I want you living in a safer lipid neighborhood. And if I use a statin, the most bang for my buck with LDL cholesterol lowering or ApoB reduction is with the first dose of my statin. Every subsequent doubling of the statin, you get maybe 6% additional LDL cholesterol lowering, but you increase the risk of side effects a ton. For instance, new onset diabetes, which is also a real effect, because they inhibit the glucose uptake into your cells, which I don't love, okay? But that is magnified at higher doses. A moderate intensity statin over 5 years, and this is a meta-analysis of over 120,000 patients, 10% increased risk in new onset diabetes. That's not that much. But high intensity over that same time frame, 36%. Oh, dang. And knowing that we only get 6% additional lowering with each subsequent doubling, I'm inclined to say, hey, I'm going to use this in combo with something else off the bat, and then we can live happily ever after, and you're probably not going to have muscle pains, you're probably not going to have worsening of your glucose metabolism. I'm not going to jeopardize your home security system while I'm getting you living in a safer lipid neighborhood. And from a biochemical perspective, as I land the plane on this very detailed talk, your body fights you. When you're trying to get living in a safer lipid neighborhood, your body's fighting you. It's like, darn it, this is home. I've always lived here. Yeah, but your home is terrible. You've been broken into. The criminals are there left and right. And what happens is when you decrease cholesterol synthesis with a statin, your body increases its absorption. Well, how do we decrease absorption? Use some ezetimibe. And so statin plus ezetimibe is a wonderful combination, and you can get better LDL cholesterol lowering, if that's the goal, better ApoB lowering, and minimize the side effects. Okay. And then additionally, PCSK9, remember that guy? Puts your LDL receptor claw grabbers out of commission. Well, statins actually increase PCSK9 levels because your body's fighting you. Atorvastatin 80 milligrams increases PCSK9 levels 46%. Okay, well, guess what? We have a class of medications, PCSK9 inhibitors, that can take care of that issue. And so all of these tools in our lipid-lowering toolbox work in synergy if there's a reason to use them. And I think that that's an important point for people. And, I think that also one of the things too, from a practical standpoint, if people are having some muscle symptoms, people have talked about CoQ10 and things like that. There isn't really strong data to support that. But one of the more promising things for abrogating statin-associated muscle symptoms is creatine, actually. And so statins also decrease creatine synthesis. There is an enzyme called guanidinoacetate acetate methyltransferase that is the committed enzymatic step in creatine synthesis. Statins also decrease that. But hey, creatine is actually one of the few supplements that actually is useful in multiple contexts and actually does something. And there's a few small studies that showed reduction of over 50% in muscle symptoms when people who had those statin-associated muscle symptoms were on creatine. So, there are ways to talk about that. There are ways that we can perhaps abrogate those things. And also we have multiple tools in our therapeutic toolbox too, in order to rectify those things and not impair your quality of life and also not disturb your home security system as we're getting you living in a safer lipid neighborhood. I know that was a lot, but hopefully there was some good stuff there for people.
No, there was a lot, which is why I let you just go off, because I knew you had a method to everything. So I want to talk about, I know people have come to me, friends, we've discussed this, who their doctors had want to put them on a statin, but these are like very fit people. These are not overweight people. These are they're surfing in their 60s. They're all kinds of things. So can we talk about diet? Because they said, well, can I just, check my diet, do this, do this? How do diet, exercise, and some of these supplements that you talked about, I feel like creatine could be a whole other episode, but I feel like because there is resistance, right? And a lot of healthier people don't want to be on medication, right? They're like, I've never been on a medication. I don't want to be on this. But what was good, you talked about a lot of the things that statins do that maybe will get people to pause a little bit and think about the whole system, not just one number. But how, when somebody walks out of the office and they're questioning, how do diet and exercise work with, or say, alone, or say with a statin, those people who are still pretty resistant, who maybe want to try lifestyle before they go on any kind of medication?
Sure. And what I would first say is, why are you being recommended a statin? I doubt that clinician got a CAC, because the number needed to treat for statin people in midlife who have a coronary artery calcium score of 0 ranges from 3,571 to infinity. And number needed to treat means, okay, this is the likelihood that somebody would actually benefit, and the drug would serve its intended purpose of you not having a cardiac event. And so, honestly, asymptomatic person, CAC of 0 in midlife, do you need a statin or any lipid-lowering therapy? I mean, there are some rare exceptions there, but I think that a lot of times these clinicians are relying on 10-year risk calculators. And once you get a certain age, you're immediately do not pass go, do not collect $500. You are at high risk just because of your age. Well, hold on. We're trying to be super agers here. Age is but a number. And so, I feel like you, and hopefully myself too, tend to be thought of as much younger than we are. And until people realize how long I went to school, I tend to run around with kids a lot, and they think I'm in my 20s. Okay, I'll take that, and so that's kind of what we want. So, just relying on the 10-year risk calculators once again is garbage. And let's actually get some imaging to better inform our decision-making process. So anyway, first off, there's that. Now, as far as diet goes, there are certain diets that can just lower a number. If you go on an extreme low-fat and let's even combo vegan low-fat diet, you probably will drop your LDL cholesterol doing that. That said, I mean, is there a reason to? As far as diet goes, there are multiple dietary patterns that can keep you living in a safe lipid neighborhood, and also, more importantly, I would say, make sure you're not insulin resistant. The standard American diet just isn't one of them. And so whatever dietary pattern you're adhering to, my thing is prioritize protein, eat real food. And then go crush it at life and be a high performer. And one of my favorite studies is all of these nutritional epidemiology things are messy, but they're based on observational and food logs. And although there are a few RCTs on the Mediterranean diet, Predimed and Cardioprev, it's just a different context, right? But the Cooper Clinic, they took these people who were in the highest quartiles of aerobic fitness, which you can't fake. You can't fake that. And they did their food logs. And some people were in the healthy food category, which is still kind of arbitrary. And some people were in the, that's okay, but not great. And then some people were in the, you have a unhealthy diet. And guess what? The event rates were all identical as far as all-cause mortality and cardiovascular disease. Now, I'm not saying you should go and eat corn dogs or do all these other things, but what I'm going to say is, prioritize performance. And when you prioritize performance, you're probably going to fuel the machine in a way that prioritizes protein, eats real food, and then go be awesome. And that's my general approach, because dietary, it gets really tribal and it's really odd. And I think the effect sizes of various patterns outside of really extreme things are quite minimal when you adjust for performance and just being awesome at life.
No, I love that you're saying that, because it's funny that you brought up the calcium score again, because friends of mine who did come to me, I actually said that right away. Like, did you get a calcium? What's that? Right away. And I said, why don't you go see if you can get that? You'll probably have to pay out of pocket, but it's worth it. It'll answer a lot of questions. Cause my mom traditionally runs high too. I mean, she's in her 70s, but she's not overweight. She never smoked. She's not a drinker. Right away, she's like, I don't want to go on a statin, Rosie. And I said, well, go get your calcium. Ask, why didn't he do, and it's like, I'm not downing anybody. I mean, doctors are very limited on time, but like you said, I think things are changing though. I think some of the younger doctors are like a little more open to different types of testing, but she got her calcium score and it was great. I'm like, you know what? I'm good. Like, I don't want you to, she's like, they push, so not that she's anti anything, but she just doesn't, she's like, I think she did try it and didn't feel good. She didn't feel good, like you said, but she eats great. She doesn't have, and I'm like, Mom, I think you're good without it. And knock on wood, God willing, she's been great for several years. So again, I'm not downing a statin, but like you said, you're questioning. Nobody wants to just take, there's a lot of people that want medication, and then there's a lot of people that don't want medication. And then there's in the middle, right? So I think the goal of today too is to understand this and like, what can people do to live your optimal self? But I love the way you focus, like performance, and all these things, like chances are if you're doing this, it's going to lead to this. The good things in your life are going to naturally push out the bad things when you fill your life.
And I think that, except for HDL cholesterol, that's but really, I think that what it speaks to, and in the course of this conversation, I hope people can appreciate that you must individualize everything. There is no cookie cutter approach to this. There are certain axioms as far as don't be insulin resistant is the big one there, and, control the blood pressure and not be systemically inflamed and don't do drugs. But everything else requires a lot of context, and you have to be thoughtful in your approach. And what worked for somebody else might not work for this person. And it's important to meet people where they're at, because we all have the goal of not having heart attacks, strokes, and end-line dementia. It's just a matter of getting there together rather than beating somebody over the head with what you think is the right thing to do because I've got this credential. It's like, well, no, let's guide people there. Let's explain things, and then we can live better together.
No, I think it's great. All right. Well, with that, as we start to wrap things up here, I'm going to ask just a couple of questions.
Yep.
So, because in the spirit of second opinion, because that's what it's all about, getting different perspective, could you give me the best piece of advice that you've ever received and maybe the worst piece of advice that you've ever received?
The best
Sometimes bad things are good.
Yeah. The best piece of advice I have ever received is from my father, who is an amazing man. And it was, Josh, there really aren't that many things that matter in life. Just love God and love people, and then go crush it. And really, he's right, because people major on the minor way too much. People dwell on minutia, and it just robs your joy in the journey. We've got one life. Every day is a gift. And the biggest blessings and the best things are the people you get to meet along the way. I've been so blessed to have so many adventures, and it's just the wonderful friends and the wonderful relationships you build, because when God gives a gift, he wraps it in a person. And so that's the good stuff. And most of the really cool things, and most of the best things in life can be found on a playground, or, if you are feeling down on life, go to a kid's like Christmas pageant or something. That's where I was last night. And my daughter had a solo, and it was impressive. I'd never heard her sing before. It was really good. Proud dad moment, right? And so most of those things, the good stuff in life, go hold on to that, and don't ever stop learning. Don't ever stop moving. And I think you'll have a lot of joy in the journey. Bad advice, pretty much just go on Twitter or X, I guess, and you'll hear all sorts of terrible advice on a daily basis when it comes to all these things. I'm just here. I'm just a guy who's been blessed to learn a bunch of stuff and hopefully help people find the signal amidst the noise. Pretty much every flavor of terrible advice, from either some shirtless influencer or some misguided clinician, will be found on the internet these days. And that's why I have to go write books about this stuff.
Well, no, I agree. And that's what was one of the things that drove me to start this podcast. I was in news, and then I was in the OR, and then news, I had to adhere to a narrative of a network, because that's just the way it goes. And then in healthcare, we have another narrative. But then I thought that I saw which drove me into journalism as a healthcare person, seeing the disconnect of what people know, how people react, and just not getting the right information. But it was very kind of similar. You're writing books. I started this podcast. And I think your intention to just get information, good information to people, hence not a 20-year-old influencer going to tell me why I should take creatine in an apartment probably they didn't even buy. I'm just like, and not to down influencers, but it's a problem with medical health information for sure. So I'm glad you touched upon that.
Yeah, the jacked 20-something-year-old guy is really good at being 20. And so that's really the reality. And so God bless him.
Listen, and as I wrap this up, I said to the 25-year-old, and and nothing against these people. It's great that they're young and very focused on these things. But I'm like, girl, why don't you add X, Y, and Z and come back to me at 50? That's what I always say. Like we all rock it at 25, pretty much up until 35. But when you see these health, when they look, like you said, good, and I actually even wanted to take away that stigma. You look great for your age. I'm like, can you just say we look good? Like,
Yeah.
why
Uh-huh.
does it have to be for your age, right? So it's fun.
Cool.
All right. Well, listen, thank you so much. I want to give you a little bit of a platform too. How can people find your book? I'm listening to it on Audible. Or do you see people outside of, I know you're very busy, but how do people find you, basically?
Yeah, so I am on LinkedIn. I post stuff there that hopefully helps people laugh a little and reflect on the good stuff in life. You can find me there. I have a presence a little bit on X, formerly known as Twitter. There's a lot of sophisticated lipid conversations there. Most people probably don't want any of that. Your best bet is to go on Amazon, and my book is called The Home Security System and the Lipid Neighborhood. And there's also an audio book, but there's also a remixed second edition for the clinician and anyone on a mission for more lipid tuition, because sometimes I'm compelled to rap about these things. And I've been known to do so at major conferences too, for the people, if that's what they want. But anyway, you can find those there. And I would recommend the first edition if you enjoyed this conversation, if you want more. And then if you've read the first edition or you just can't help yourself and you want 150 more pages on some real deep dive topics in the second edition, that's there for you as well. And so I try to just be a resource for people and hopefully laugh a little, learn a little, and then come away not having heart attack, strokes, and dementia at the end of the day.
I have to say, like I said, I am reading it and it's the humor I really appreciate because I feel like I see myself in you in some of it. Just whether you're sitting in the classroom talking about writing an essay or, that's my science side coming out, but I really do appreciate it. So, and I know people who are listening, I think they would enjoy it as well. So, but congrats to you. It's very well done.
Thank you. It's people say, I never thought I'd laugh so much reading a book about cholesterol. And I say, well, that's the best medicine sometimes still, So anyway, I have fun with stuff. I don't take myself too seriously, but what I do take seriously is the blessings I've been given and the opportunity I have to hopefully help people make some sense of what's going on out there when it comes to adding life to our collective years.
All right. Well, that's a great way to end it. So I am just going to wrap it up here. And that is today's episode of Second Opinion. A huge thank you to Josh Wageman for bringing clarity, heart, and humanity to one of the most misunderstood topics in modern medicine. And we covered a lot today, and this conversation did click for you. I do highly recommend his book, The Home Security System and the Lipid Neighborhood. As Josh just said, it is available on Audible, and it's definitely one of those listens you'll come back to. In season 2, we are in it. I was actually going to save this episode, but I think I'm going to drop it next week because I think it's very good information that people could start on this time of year. Like, why put this off till January? I think people need to know this while we're in the heat of the holiday season. And send your questions, your story ideas or your guest suggestions to me through my website, rosemarieb.com. And I read every single one. It might take me a minute, but just hang in there. I will get back to you because getting a second opinion isn't just smart medicine. It's smart living. It's how we're going to find better answers, better health, and sometimes a whole new chapter. Again, if this supported you, follow, rate it, and just leave a quick review. Every share helps get this movement grow. I'm Rosemarie Belt, and this is your Second Opinion, where science meets story, and age is always, always, always your advantage. Till next time.